Here's something I want you to think about. You know every sound your life makes. You know it so well you've stopped hearing most of it. The hum of your refrigerator, the way your floors settle at night, the specific pitch of wind against your windows depending on which direction it's coming from. Your brain catalogs all of it, files it under safe ignore, and lets you sleep. But every once in a while you hear something that doesn't have a file, something your brain reaches for and comes back empty. No category, no explanation, no match in the entire library of sounds you've accumulated across every year of your life. And in that moment, that gap between hearing and understanding, you are more alert than you have ever been. Every cell in your body is awake, waiting for the sound to repeat so you can place it, explain it, go back to feeling safe. Sometimes it repeats, and you figure it out. A branch on the roof, a raccoon in the trash, the neighbor's kid bouncing a ball at midnight, because kids are chaos agents who don't respect circadian rhythms. But sometimes the sound doesn't repeat. Or worse, it does repeat and you still can't explain it. It comes back and back and back, and every time it does, the gap between hearing and understanding gets wider instead of narrower. And you start to realize that maybe the reason you can't place this sound is that it doesn't belong to any category you have. Because it doesn't belong in your world at all. Tonight I have 3 stories. 3 situations where people heard something they couldn't explain. Not ghost stories, I want to be clear about that. These aren't campfire tales. These are accounts from people in ordinary places, doing ordinary things, who encountered a sound that broke the pattern of everything they knew. What makes these stories stay with you isn't the sound itself. It's what happened when they went looking for the source. The first story takes place in a building where sound is the entire job. For Yanquity, Gavin Marsh had been a sound engineer at KQPR for 11 years. KQPR was a public radio station in Duluth, Minnesota, the kind of station that ran local news in the morning, classical music in the afternoon, and community programming in the evening. Small staff, 12 people total. If you counted the part-time volunteers who answered phones during pledge drives, the building was a converted dental office on East Superior Street, about 4 blocks from Lake Superior, close enough that on quiet nights with the windows cracked, you could hear the water. Gavin's job was straightforward. He managed the technical side of broadcast, mixing boards, microphones, signal levels, equipment maintenance. He made sure what went out over the airwaves sounded clean, and what came back through the monitoring systems matched what was supposed to be there. He was good at it. Not good in a flashy way. Sound engineering at a small public radio station isn't a field that rewards flash. Good in the way that mattered, consistent, precise, attentive. He could hear a 60 Hz hum buried under a full orchestral recording and trace it to a grounding issue in a patch cable. He could tell the difference between mic bleed and room reflection without looking at the waveform. His ears were his instruments, and he'd spent a decade calibrating them. The station operated from 5 a.m. to midnight, 7 days a week. After midnight, the broadcast switched to automated programming, pre-recorded shows, syndicated content, dead air protocols that kicked in if something glitched. Nobody needed to be in the building after midnight. The system ran itself, but Gavin was often there late. Not because he had to be, because the building was quiet after hours, and quiet was where he did his best work. Equipment maintenance, software updates, archive transfers. The kind of tasks that required focus and were impossible during the day. When people were coming and going and the phone was ringing, and Diane from Community Outreach was heating up fish in the break room microwave like a person without a conscience. So Gavin was alone in the building, frequently between midnight and 2 or 3 a.m. He'd been doing this for years. He knew every sound the building made at night, the HVAC cycling on and off, the fluorescent lights buzzing in the hallway, the gentle tick of the broadcast equipment cooling down after a full day of operation. He knew the building the way a sailor knows their boat. Every creak had a cause, every hum had a source. On the Thursday night in late January, and January in Duluth is a specific kind of cold, the kind that makes the building contract audibly, the kind where you can hear ice forming on the windows if you hold still. Gavin was in Studio B, working on archiving a series of interviews from the previous month. Studio B was the smaller of the 2 recording studios. It was designed for voice work, interviews, solo narration, podcast recording. The room was acoustically treated to an almost aggressive degree, foam panels on every wall, a floating floor, a sealed door with rubber gaskets, and a double-pane observation window looking into the control room. When you closed the door to Studio B, the outside world effectively ceased to exist from an audio perspective. The noise floor in that room was so low that most people found it uncomfortable. You could hear your own blood moving, your own joints shifting, the wet sound of your eyes blinking. Gavin was used to it. He liked it. The silence in Studio B felt like a tool, not an absence. He was sitting at the desk, headphones around his neck, not on, just resting there, transferring files from a portable recorder to the station's archive drive. The door to Studio B was closed. The control room on the other side of the observation window was dark. The hallway beyond that was empty. At approximately 1:15 a.m., Gavin heard a tone. Not through the headphones, not through the monitors. In the room, in the air, a single sustained tone, low, steady. Somewhere around 200 hertz, roughly the G below middle C on a piano. Not loud, not quiet. Present, like someone had pressed a key on an organ in the next room and was holding it down. Gavin stopped what he was doing and listened. The tone continued. It didn't waver, didn't pulse, didn't shift in pitch. It was constant in a way that immediately told him it was mechanical or electrical, not organic. Organic sounds, voices, instruments, animals have natural variation, micro-fluctuations in frequency. This had none. It was flat, perfect, like a test tone. Gavin's first thought was equipment. Something in the room was generating a signal, a cable picking up interference, a monitor left on standby, a ground loop somewhere in the wiring. He dealt with all of these before. He started troubleshooting. He turned off the archive drive. Tone there. He unplugged the portable recorder. Still there. He powered down the desk monitor. Still there. He reached behind the desk and flipped the power strip, killing everything connected to the workstation. The tone continued. Gavin stood up. He walked around the room slowly, tilting his head, trying to locate the source by proximity. This is something sound engineers do instinctively. You move through the space and let your ears triangulate. Closer means louder. The direction the sound is clearest tells you where it's coming from. But the tone didn't get louder or quieter as he moved. It stayed exactly the same volume, the same quality, regardless of where he stood. Center of the room, corner of the room, by the door, by the window. Identical. That was wrong. That shouldn't be possible. Sound radiates from a source. It obeys physics. It follows the inverse square law. Double your distance from the source, and the intensity drops by a factor of 4. A sound that doesn't change with distance either, has no single source point or is being generated everywhere in the room simultaneously. Gavin opened the door to Studio B. The moment the seal broke, the moment the rubber gasket released and the door swung into the control room, the tone stopped. Instantly. Not a fade, not a decay. A hard stop, like someone hit mute. Gavin stood in the doorway. The control room was dark and silent. The hallway beyond was dark and silent. The building was exactly as empty as it had been 5 minutes ago. He stepped back into Studio B and pulled the door closed. The tone returned. Same frequency, same volume, same impossible consistency. As if it had been waiting. Gavin felt the hair on his arms stand up, and it wasn't the cold. He opened the door again. Tone stopped. Closed the door. Tone started. He did this 4 times. Each time, the result was the same. Door sealed. Tone present. Door open. Silence. Here's what Gavin was thinking, and I want you to understand this clearly because it matters. He was not thinking ghost. He was not thinking supernatural. Gavin Marsh was a man who had spent 11 years learning to understand sound through physics, through waveforms, through measurable, repeatable phenomena. He was thinking resonance. He was thinking that the sealed room was somehow creating a standing wave, a frequency generated by the room's own dimensions interacting with some external vibration. Maybe the HVAC, maybe a transformer outside, maybe the building itself contracting in the cold. Standing waves are real. They happen in acoustically treated rooms when conditions are right. A room of specific dimensions can amplify a specific frequency to the point where it seems to come from everywhere at once. The reason it stopped when the door opened was that opening the door changed the room's acoustic profile, broke the standing wave. Logical, elegant, perfectly explainable. Gavin sat back down, somewhat relieved, and made a note to check the room's acoustic profile in the morning. He'd measure the dimensions, calculate the resonant frequencies, find the source of the external vibration driving the standing wave, and solve it. He put his headphones on to continue the archive work, and that's when he heard the second thing. Through the headphones, which were plugged into nothing, the cable dangled from the left ear cup, disconnected, the jack touching nothing but air. Through these unplugged headphones, Gavin heard breathing. Not his own. He held his breath to confirm. The breathing continued. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Inhale through the nose, long exhale through the mouth. The sound quality was close, intimate, like someone breathing directly into a microphone from 2 inches away. He could hear the moisture. He could hear the soft click of a throat between breaths. Gavin pulled the headphones off. Silence. The tone was still there, still filling the room, but no breathing. He put the headphones back on. Breathing, steady, patient. Close enough that he could almost feel the warmth of it, he yanked the headphones off and dropped them on the desk. For a long moment, Gavin sat very still. He was not frightened exactly. Not yet. He was in the space between confusion and fear, the space where your brain is working very hard to build an explanation before your body decides to panic. Unplugged headphones receiving audio was not possible through any mechanism he understood. Headphones are passive devices. They don't generate sound. They reproduce it. Without a signal, they're inert. The only way to hear something through unplugged headphones would be if the drivers were somehow picking up a strong electromagnetic signal and converting it to audio. This is theoretically possible. Headphone drivers are essentially small speakers, and speakers can act as microphones in reverse. But it would require an absurdly powerful signal at exactly the right frequency to vibrate the driver diaphragm enough to produce audible sound. There was no signal source in that room powerful enough to do that. The room was designed specifically to block electromagnetic interference. That was the whole point of Studio B. Gavin picked up the headphones. He put them on, the breathing was gone. In its place was something else. A voice, very faint, at the absolute threshold of audibility. So quiet that Gavin had to close his eyes and focus every ounce of his attention to make it out. It was speaking, continuously. Steady stream of words in a cadence that sounded like reading, like someone reading aloud from a text. The pitch was low, probably male, but the volume was so minimal that Gavin couldn't make out individual words. It was like listening to someone talk in the next room through a closed door. You could tell they were speaking, you could sense the rhythm and intonation of language, but the content was just out of reach. Gavin pressed the ear cups tighter against his head. He strained. He caught one fragment. 3 words, just barely clear enough to register. Already in here, then silence. Complete, total silence. The voice stopped. The tone stopped. The headphones went dead. Gavin took the headphones off. The room was silent. The impossible tone that had been filling Studio B for the past 15 minutes was gone. The air felt different, flatter, deader, the way an acoustically treated room is supposed to feel. He sat at the desk for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stood up, opened the door, walked through the control room, walked down the hallway, put on his coat, and left the building. He sat in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes with the engine running and the heat on full. He did not go back inside. The next morning, Gavin came in early, before anyone else, but after sunrise, in daylight, which he would later admit mattered to him more than he wanted it to. He went to Studio B with a spectrum analyzer, a field recorder, and a multimeter. He measured the room's resonant frequencies. He checked every cable, every connector, every piece of equipment for stray signal. He tested the headphones, different ones in the same pair from the night before. He measured electromagnetic levels in the room. Everything was normal. The room's resonant frequency was nowhere near 200 hertz. It was closer to 80, which would sound like a low rumble, not the clear tone he'd heard. There was no stray electromagnetic signal strong enough to drive an unplugged headphone driver. The headphones themselves tested perfectly. Silent when disconnected, functional when plugged in. He told his colleague Ray about it. Ray was the station's other technician, semi-retired, worked mornings. Ray listened carefully, nodded, and said something that Gavin didn't expect. Was it the first time? Gavin asked what he meant. Ray said that Marta, a woman who had worked at the station before Gavin, who'd left about 2 years before he started, had reported something similar in Studio B. Not exactly the same, but similar. A tone that filled the room when the door was sealed. She'd mentioned it once at a staff meeting, described it as the room humming to itself. Nobody had taken it seriously. Marta was known for being a little eccentric. She'd moved to Ashland, Oregon. Nobody stayed in touch. Gavin asked if anyone else had experienced it. Ray said, "People don't spend time in Studio B with the door closed unless they're recording. And when they're recording, the equipment is on. Maybe you don't hear it over the equipment." That bothered Gavin. The implication that the sound was always there, constant, present, waiting in the silence of a sealed room, and that the only reason nobody noticed was that there was always enough noise to mask it. He asked Ray about the voice. Ray shook his head. Marta never mentioned a voice. Gavin went back to Studio B that night. Same conditions. Late, alone, equipment off, door sealed. No tone, no breathing, no voice. Perfect silence. He went back the next night. Same thing. Nothing. He went back every night for 2 weeks. Nothing. On the 15th night, a Wednesday, 2 weeks and 1 day after the original incident, Gavin sealed the door, sat at the desk, and waited. At 1:22 a.m., the tone returned. Same frequency, same impossible consistency. Same behavior, present with the door sealed, absent with the door open. This time, Gavin was prepared. He had a battery-powered field recorder. No cables, no connections to external power. Nothing that could receive a signal. He hit record and set it on the desk. He put on the headphones, unplugged, same pair. Breathing, slow, steady, familiar. Then the voice, clearer this time. Still faint, still at the threshold, but Gavin could make out more. It was reading, definitely reading. The cadence was measured, deliberate, with pauses at regular intervals as if reaching the end of a sentence or a paragraph. The voice had a quality that Gavin struggled to describe later. He said it sounded local, not distant, not transmitted, not echoed. It sounded like someone standing in the room, speaking very quietly, directly into the headphones he was wearing. He caught more fragments. "The walls are thinner than you think." And later, maybe a minute later, "Been here since before the foam." And then, very clearly, in a moment where the voice seemed to move from background to foreground, to step from behind the curtain of near silence into something close to conversational. "Gavin, you don't need to keep the headphones on. I can hear you either way." Gavin stopped the recorder. He took off the headphones. He stood up. He did not leave this time. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the second time and the first time hadn't heard him. Maybe because he was an engineer and the recorder was running and he needed to know what it captured. Maybe because something about the voice, the tone of it, the cadence, didn't feel threatening. It felt patient. He picked up the recorder and played back the last 3 minutes. The recording captured the tone perfectly. A clean 200 hertz sine wave, consistent, exactly as he'd heard it. The station's audio forensics were rudimentary, but the waveform was clear on the recorder's screen. The breathing was not on the recording. The voice was not on the recording. The recorder, sitting on the desk in the same room, had captured the room tone and nothing else. Whatever Gavin had heard through the unplugged headphones existed only in the headphones, or only for him. Gavin took the recorder, the headphones, and his coat, and he left the building. He didn't go back to Studio B at night after that. Not because he was told not to. Not because anything happened that forced him to stop. He simply decided, in a way that he described as clear and final, that he had heard enough. He continued working at KQPR for another 3 years before taking a position at a larger station in Minneapolis. During those 3 years, he occasionally heard the tone during daytime recording sessions in Studio B, faintly, briefly, usually for just a few seconds before it stopped. He never mentioned it to anyone. He never put on unplugged headphones again. But here's the detail that I keep coming back to. The fragment he heard, "Been here since before the foam." The acoustic foam in Studio B had been installed in 2008, 3 years before Gavin started. The building itself dated to the 1960s. Before the foam, before the floating floor, before the acoustic treatment. Studio B had been a dental examination room. Gavin looked up the building's history once, casually on a lunch break. He found a Duluth News-Tribune article from 1987 about the dental practice that had occupied the space. The article was routine, a retirement announcement for the dentist, a Dr. Alan Kessler, who had practiced there for 31 years. The article included a photo of Dr. Kessler in his office. Behind him, on the wall of what was now Studio B, there was a radio, an old tabletop AM radio, turned on, its dial glowing. The caption read, "Dr. Kessler with the radio he kept playing for patients during procedures. It relaxes them," he said. They focus on the sound instead of the drill. The radio in the photo was tuned to a frequency Gavin couldn't read. The station it was playing was unclear. But the radio had sat in that room, playing sound into that space, for 31 years. And then the foam went up, and the room went silent. Gavin didn't tell me what he thinks this means. He didn't offer an interpretation. When the person who relayed this story asked him directly, "Do you think the room was haunted?" Gavin said something that I found more unsettling than any ghost story I've ever heard. He said, "I don't think the room was haunted. I think the room was full." 31 years of sound absorbed into the walls, and when everything else went quiet, truly quiet, quieter than that space had been in 3 decades, it started giving it back. I don't know what to do with that. Neither did Gavin, neither will you. But I'll tell you this. The next time you're in a very quiet room, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, sealed, almost pressurized, and you hear something you can't explain, consider the possibility that you're not hearing something new. You're hearing something old, something that's been waiting in the walls for someone to finally stop making enough noise to hear it. Second candle. I need to tell you about a woman named Priya Chandran and the worst shift she ever worked. Priya was a 911 dispatcher for the city of Tacoma, Washington. She'd been dispatching for 6 years, long enough to be good at it, long enough to have developed the specific kind of emotional armor that the job requires, and long enough to know that the armor had cracks she'd need to deal with eventually. Dispatching is a job most people misunderstand. They think it's answering phones. It's not. It's triage under pressure, taking incomplete, often incoherent information from people in the worst moments of their lives and converting it into actionable instructions for responders in real time. You're simultaneously listening, typing, talking, reading your screen, monitoring your units, and managing your own nervous system so that the panic in the caller's voice doesn't become panic in yours. Priya worked the night shift, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., 3 days on, 4 days off. The night shift in Tacoma was steady. Not as relentless as Seattle, not as quiet as the smaller surrounding municipalities. Busy enough to keep you sharp, slow enough occasionally to let you breathe. The center where Priya worked was modern. Renovated in 2019 with new consoles, new headsets, improved call routing, 12 dispatch positions, though they rarely staffed more than 8 at a time. Each position had 3 monitors, a headset with a boom mic, and a foot pedal for push-to-talk on the radio. You listened to callers through the headset and talked to field units through the same headset on a different channel. Switching between them was second nature. Left ear, right ear, caller, responder. 2 worlds, 1 head. On a Friday night in October, the kind of Friday where the calls start early and stack up because it's payday, and the weather's just cold enough to make people restless. Priya was handling a routine call. Domestic disturbance. Caller was a neighbor, not a participant. She'd heard shouting from the apartment next door and was worried about the woman who lived there. Priya was gathering details, address, apartment number, how many voices the caller could hear, any sounds of physical violence. Standard call, standard process. Priya had handled hundreds of these. She dispatched a unit, 2 officers, and stayed on the line with the caller per protocol, keeping her updated, keeping her calm. At approximately 10:47 p.m., while the caller was mid-sentence describing the shouting she could hear through the wall, Priya heard a second voice in her headset. Not the caller, not dispatch radio, not another operator bleeding through from an adjacent console that happened sometimes with older systems, but the new equipment had isolated channels specifically to prevent it. A different voice, a child's voice. Young, maybe 5 or 6 years old, speaking clearly, calmly, with the eerie composure that children sometimes have when they've been frightened past the point of crying. The child said, "The door is red." That was it. 3 words, then silence. The caller continued talking, uninterrupted, unaware. The dispatch radio was quiet. The unit was still en route. Priya's headset returned to normal. Caller in one ear, radio in the other. Priya blinked. She looked at her console. Her channel assignments were correct. She was on the line she was supposed to be on, monitoring the frequency she was supposed to be monitoring. There was no third channel. There was no incoming call queue that would have been routed through her headset. She chalked it up to a glitch. Cross-channel interference, maybe from a cell tower, maybe from a baby monitor or a cordless phone in the caller's building. It happened. Rarely, but it happened. Analog signals could bleed into digital systems under the right conditions. She finished the call. The officers arrived at the domestic. The situation was handled. Verbal argument, no physical violence, both parties separated. Routine resolution. Priya logged the call, noted the audio anomaly in her shift report, and moved on. 43 minutes later, at 11:30 p.m., she picked up another call. This one was a car accident. Single vehicle, off the road, South Tacoma Way near the rail yard. Caller was the driver, a man, shaken. Said he'd swerved to avoid something in the road and hit a guardrail. He was injured. He thought his wrist was broken, but conscious and coherent. Priya dispatched fire and EMS, kept the caller talking, started running the address for the closest unit. Mid-call, the child's voice returned. Same voice, same calm, clear tone. Same quality. Close, intimate. As if the child were speaking directly into Priya's ear rather than through any electronic system. The door is red. He painted it. Priya's hands stopped on the keyboard. She didn't react outwardly. Dispatchers are trained to maintain composure regardless of what they hear. You can't let a caller know you're rattled, and you absolutely can't let a field unit hear uncertainty in your voice. Priya kept talking to the driver, kept coordinating the response. But inside something shifted, because this time the voice was clearer. And this time she heard something behind it. Not words, but a quality. A spatial quality. The child's voice had room sound, the faintest suggestion of echo, the way a voice sounds when it's spoken in a small, enclosed space. A bathroom, maybe. A closet, a room with hard surfaces and no soft furnishings to absorb the sound. Priya finished the call. She took off her headset, set it on the desk, and sat for a moment. Her colleague at the next console, Marcus, a veteran dispatcher, 15 years in, noticed her expression. "You okay?" Priya said. "I'm getting bleed on my channel." Kid's voice happened twice. Marcus frowned. "What's it saying?" "Something about a red door." Marcus shook his head. "Could be a cell signal. Could be a neighbor's baby monitor bouncing off the tower. I'd log it and swap headsets." Priya swapped headsets. She took a new one from the equipment drawer. Standard issue. Tested it on her console. Got clean audio on both channels. She logged the anomaly again, more detailed this time, and resumed her shift. For 2 hours, nothing. Normal calls, a noise complaint, a welfare check, a minor fender bender, a drunk and disorderly at a bar on Pacific Avenue. Priya handled all of them cleanly, professionally, without interruption. At 1:55 a.m., she took a call that changed everything. The caller was a woman, whispering. The kind of whisper that tells you immediately, before the words even register, that the person is hiding. There's a specific quality to a whisper that's born from necessity rather than choice. It's tighter, more controlled. The consonants are sharper because the person is pushing language through the smallest possible opening in their throat. The woman said she was in her apartment. Someone was trying to get in. She could hear them at the door. Priya went into protocol mode. Address, location in the apartment. Description of the sounds. Was the door locked? Did she know who it was? The woman gave her address. A building on East 34th Street. She was in the bedroom. The door was locked. The apartment door. The front door. She could hear someone working on the lock. Not pounding. Not kicking. Working. Methodically. Metal on metal. Priya dispatched a unit. Priority 1. She kept the woman on the line. "Stay where you are. Stay quiet. Officers are on their way." The woman was breathing hard, but staying controlled. She whispered that she lived alone. She didn't know who was at the door. She'd heard footsteps in the hallway about 10 minutes ago and thought it was a neighbor. Then the footsteps stopped at her door, and then the sound started. Priya was typing, coordinating, listening, maintaining the cadence of calm that was her job to project. And then the child's voice came back. Not faint this time, not background. The child spoke directly over the caller's whisper, layered on top of it, occupying the same space in Priya's headset, as if both voices were coming through the same microphone. "The door is red. He painted it today. He's painting hers now." Priya's breath caught. She looked at her console. One caller. One line. No cross connections. No bleed. The child's voice was impossible, not just unlikely. Not just a glitch, but structurally impossible given the equipment she was using and the architecture of the system she was plugged into. But the words, "He's painting hers now." Priya asked the caller a question that was not in any protocol she'd been trained on. She asked it because the voice in her ear had told her something and she needed to know if it was real. "What color is your front door?" The woman paused. In the silence of that pause, Priya could hear the metallic scratching at the door. Faint, rhythmic, patient. "What?" the woman whispered. "Your front door? What color is it?" It's red. I painted it last weekend. Why are you?" Priya didn't hear the rest of the sentence. Because in that moment, the child's voice returned, and this time it said something that Priya has never repeated publicly. She told one person, a department counselor, during a mandatory post-incident session, and the counselor included it in a report that was filed and, as far as I know, never discussed again. What the child said was a name, a first and last name, and then he has a key. He made it from the one under the mat. She moved the mat, but he already had it. Priya made a decision. She broke protocol. She said to the caller, "Do you know someone named?" And she said the name the child had given her. The woman on the phone made a sound, not a word. A sound, the kind of sound that is prior to language, that comes from a place beneath speech. A recognition so deep and so frightened that it bypassed every cognitive process and came out as a raw vocal reflex. Then she said, very quietly, "That's my ex-boyfriend." Priya relayed the name to the responding unit. She added it to the dispatch notes. She told the officers they were responding to a possible stalking situation with a known suspect. The officers arrived in 4 minutes. They found a man in the hallway outside the woman's apartment. He was kneeling in front of her door with a key, a hand-cut copy, poorly made, filed down enough to fit but not enough to turn smoothly. He'd been working it in the lock for approximately 15 minutes. His name matched the one the child's voice had given Priya. He was arrested. He had in his car parked outside the building a bag containing zip ties, duct tape, and a change of clothes. The case was prosecuted. He was convicted. The woman was safe. And Priya sat at her console for the remaining 5 hours of her shift and did not hear the child's voice again. Here's what happened after. Priya reported the audio anomaly. She reported it thoroughly, all 3 incidents, the escalating clarity, the specific information the voice had provided. Her supervisor, a man named Hank Torres, listened to the recordings. There were recordings. Every call that comes through a 911 center is recorded. Every dispatch channel is logged. Hank listened to all 3 calls. The domestic disturbance, the car accident, the break-in. In none of the recordings was there a child's voice. The audio was clean. Caller, dispatcher, radio traffic. Nothing else. No bleed. No interference. No third voice. Hank told Priya this carefully. The way you tell someone something you know they won't want to hear. He said the recordings didn't support what she described. He suggested stress. He suggested auditory fatigue, a real phenomenon in dispatchers who work extended night shifts with constant headset use. The brain starts filling in patterns, manufacturing sound from noise. Priya nodded. She accepted the explanation. She filed her report with the note unable to confirm via recording and went home. She didn't sleep that day. She sat in her apartment and thought about what she knew. She knew that a voice, a child's voice, impossible, unrecorded, existing only in her headset and only for her, had given her a man's name. A real name, belonging to a real person who was at that moment committing a real crime against a real woman. She had not known the name. She had not known the caller. She had no prior information about the case that could have produced the name through memory or subconscious connection. The name came from nowhere she could explain and went to the one place it was needed. The counselor she spoke to asked her the obvious question. Where do you think the voice came from? Priya said, I don't think it came from anywhere. I think it was already in the line. I think it's always in the line. The counselor asked what she meant. Priya said something that I need to relay carefully because it's the kind of thing that sounds irrational until you think about it for too long, at which point it stops sounding irrational and starts sounding like something you wish you hadn't considered. She said, do you know how many 911 calls we take in a year? In this center alone? Tens of thousands. People in the worst moments of their lives, screaming, crying, begging for help, dying. All of it goes through these lines. All of it gets recorded and stored and archived, but it goes through the lines first. Every night I sit here with these headphones on, plugged into a system that has carried more human terror than any other infrastructure in the city. She paused. I don't think I heard a ghost. I think I heard a residue. I think the system is saturated, and every once in a while, when the conditions are right, when it's late, when the building is quiet, when someone on the other end is frightened enough, something that went through the line before comes back through, not randomly, not as noise, as a signal, as information. The counselor wrote this down. Priya went back to work the following week. She continued dispatching for another 2 years before transferring to an administrative role. She never heard the child's voice again. But here's the part that stayed with her. The part she mentioned to one person, once, and then never discussed again. She went back through the center's archived calls. She searched for the name the child had given her, the ex-boyfriend's name. She wanted to know if he had appeared in any prior 911 call, any prior incident, anything that was already in the system. She found one. 8 months before Priya's shift, 8 months before the woman with the red door, there had been a 911 call from a different address. A child had called. A young child, barely old enough to use a phone. The child had reported that the man was hurting mommy. The child had given an address. Officers had responded. The man in that call, the man who was hurting mommy, had the same name, the same person. Different victim, different address, same man. And the child who had called 911 8 months earlier. The child's voice was on that recording. Priya listened to it. It was the same voice, the same child. The same calm, clear, impossibly composed voice that had spoken to her through dead channels and unplugged headsets on a Friday night in October. The child in the original call was the man's daughter. She was 5 years old. She had called 911 from her mother's phone while hiding in the bathroom. The case had been investigated. The man had been arrested, released on bail, and subsequently lost contact with both the child and her mother, who had moved out of state. The daughter was safe. She was living in another city. She had not called 911 since. But her voice, her 5-year-old voice recorded 8 months earlier, stored on a server, carried through the same system Priya sat plugged into every night, that voice had come back. It had come back with new information. Information it shouldn't have had. A red door, a copied key, a name. And it had come back to the one person who was listening. Priya doesn't work dispatch anymore. She works in emergency management planning now. Logistics, policy, no headset, no open line. She told the counselor she transferred because of burnout. But the person who told me this story said Priya once admitted the real reason. Late, after drinks, in a moment of honesty, she immediately tried to walk back. She said, "I stopped because I was afraid I'd hear her again. And I was more afraid that the next time I wouldn't be able to help." She paused. And the time after that, the voice would know. The collection, the Hargrove Public Library in Corvallis, Oregon, was built in 1952 and expanded twice, once in 1978 and again in 2003. It sat on Monroe Avenue, 2 blocks from the Oregon State campus, in a neighborhood of coffee shops and bookstores and Victorian houses converted into therapist offices. It was, by every measure, a pleasant and unremarkable building. The main floor had the circulation desk, the periodicals, the public computers, and the children's section. The second floor had the reference collection, study rooms, and the local history archive. The basement, added during the 1978 expansion, had the overflow stacks, a community meeting room, and the mechanical systems. Boiler, HVAC, electrical panels. The basement was not open to the public. Sign on the stairwell door said staff only, and the door required a key card. In practice, nobody went down there except maintenance staff, and occasionally a librarian retrieving something from the overflow stacks. The head librarian was a woman named Joan Fessler. Joan had worked at Hargrove for 22 years. She was 61, methodical, and possessed the kind of quiet authority that made college students lower their voices without being asked. She ran the building the way a conductor runs an orchestra, not with volume, but with precision. Joan's relationship with the basement was practical. She went down once a week to check the overflow stacks for mold. The basement had a humidity problem that the 1978 contractors had never fully resolved, and once a month to meet with the HVAC technician. She did not like the basement. She wouldn't have said she was afraid of it. She would have said it was poorly lit, too warm, and smelled like old paper and copper pipes. But the truth, which Joan admitted only to her assistant Carla, was that the basement made her uneasy in a way she couldn't justify. The air felt different down there. Heavy, not warm heavy, occupied heavy. the way a room feels when someone has just left it. Joan had worked in libraries for her entire career. She understood the feeling of rooms full of words, the particular atmospheric weight of being surrounded by language, even when no one is reading, even when the books are closed. She'd always found it comforting. Libraries felt populated to her in a way that had nothing to do with patrons. The basement felt populated in a different way. But Joan was not a person who made decisions based on feelings she couldn't explain. So she went to the basement on schedule and did her job. And if she moved a little faster down there, if she checked the stacks a little more quickly than thoroughness demanded, she never acknowledged it. The event I need to tell you about happened on a Tuesday in February at approximately 2:15 p.m. The library was moderately busy. 31 people in the building. Joan knew this because the electronic counter at the front door tracked entries and exits, and she'd checked it that morning out of habit. 31 patrons plus 4 staff members. Joan, Carla, a part-time shelver named Miguel, and a volunteer named Dorothy who worked the information desk on Tuesdays. At 2:15 p.m., the building's fire alarm went off. This was not in itself unusual. The Hargrove fire system was old, original to the 1978 expansion, updated piecemeal over the years but never fully replaced. It triggered perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, always false alarms. A steam pipe tripping a heat sensor. A patron microwaving popcorn in the community room. Once, memorably, a child pulling a manual pull station because it was red, and they were 4 years old and red things are for pulling. Joan initiated the standard evacuation. Staff guided patrons to the exits. 31 people plus 4 staff filed out through the front doors and gathered on the sidewalk along Monroe Avenue. The fire department was automatically notified. A truck would arrive in approximately 6 minutes. Joan did a walkthrough to confirm the building was empty. She checked the main floor, the second floor, the restrooms, the study rooms, all clear. Then she went to the basement. She swiped her key card, opened the stairwell door and descended. The basement lights were on. They were always on, controlled by a timer, not a switch. The mechanical room was straight ahead. The overflow stacks were to the left, behind a set of metal shelving units that formed narrow aisles. Joan walked through the mechanical room. Empty. She checked the community room. Empty. She turned left toward the overflow stacks. And she heard something. Not the fire alarm that was blaring upstairs, muffled by the floor between them but still audible. Not the boiler, not the HVAC, a sound coming from deep in the stacks. From the far end of the basement, where the shelving units pressed up against the foundation wall, it was a murmur. The best way I can describe it, and I'm pulling from Joan's own description here, relayed through Carla, is the sound of a room full of people talking very quietly. Not whispering, not shouting. The collective, overlapping murmur of a crowd at rest. The sound you hear when you walk into a restaurant before you can make out any individual conversation. A texture of voices. A fabric of language with no discernible thread. Joan stopped walking. She stood at the entrance to the stacks and listened. The murmur was continuous. It had depth. It didn't sound like it was coming from one point, but from across the entire length of the stacks, as if the shelving units themselves were vibrating with it. It was too quiet to make out words, but too loud to be imagined. It existed in the uncomfortable middle ground between perception and hallucination, where you're not sure if your ears are hearing or your brain is inventing. Joan called out, "Hello, is someone down here?" The murmur stopped, not faded, not tapered, stopped, like she'd flipped a switch. The silence that replaced it was total and immediate, and somehow louder than the murmur had been, the way the absence of a sound you'd been hearing is more noticeable than the sound itself. Joan stood very still for approximately 10 seconds. The basement was empty. The fire alarm was still ringing upstairs, faint and rhythmic. She turned and walked back to the stairwell. She went upstairs, exited the building, and told the arriving fire crew that the building was clear. The alarm was traced to a faulty heat sensor in the basement mechanical room. It was replaced. Everyone went back inside. The day continued. Joan did not mention the murmur to anyone that day. But she mentioned it to Carla 3 days later. And the reason she mentioned it was that something else had happened. After the evacuation, once patrons had returned to the building, 3 of them, independently, over the course of that afternoon and the following morning, approached the circulation desk with the same question. The first was a graduate student named Helen Park. Helen was a regular. She came in most afternoons to study in one of the second-floor study rooms. She approached the desk around 3:30 p.m., about an hour after the evacuation, and asked Carla an odd question. During the fire alarm, when we were all standing outside, did the library have speakers on? Outside speakers? Carla said no. The building didn't have exterior speakers. Helen frowned. She said that while she was standing on the sidewalk during the evacuation, she'd heard something. A voice. Not someone in the crowd. She'd been standing near the edge of the group, close to the building, but a voice that seemed to come from the building itself, from the walls, or the windows, or somewhere inside that was projecting outward. Carla asked what the voice had said. Helen said, it was reading aloud. I could hear the cadence, like someone narrating, but I couldn't make out the words. It was just below the threshold, like hearing a radio through a wall. Carla told her it was probably someone's phone or the fire alarm interacting with the building's old intercom system, which had been decommissioned in 2010, but whose wiring was still in the walls. Helen accepted this and went back to studying. The second person was a retired professor named George Kinnear. George came in the following morning, Wednesday, and mentioned it to Joan directly. He'd been standing in the evacuation group near the front doors, and he'd heard what he described as choral singing. Low, sustained, multi-voiced. He said it sounded like it was coming from below the sidewalk, from the basement. Joan asked if he was sure it wasn't the fire alarm. George said, I was a music professor for 34 years. I know the difference between an alarm and a choir. This was voices, many voices, singing something I didn't recognize. The third person was a teenager named Alexis Webb. She was a high school student who used the library's computers after school. She told Miguel, the shelver, that during the evacuation, she'd heard a lady talking like right behind me, but when I turned around, nobody was there. She'd heard the woman say a sentence, a complete, clear sentence that Alexis repeated to Miguel. Miguel told Carla. Carla told Joan. The sentence was this: the collection is complete, but the shelving is not finished. Joan felt something cold move through her when she heard this. Not because the sentence was frightening, because it was specific. It sounded like something a librarian would say. It sounded like something Joan herself would say. And because three people, standing in different parts of the same crowd, during the same event, had heard three completely different things. One heard narration, one heard singing, one heard a speaking voice. All of them described the sound as coming from the building. Joan went to the basement that afternoon alone. She brought a flashlight even though the lights were on, because the flashlight was for her, not for the dark. She walked to the overflow stacks. She stood at the entrance and waited. Silence. For 5 minutes. Absolute silence. The murmur was gone. The basement was just a basement. Old shelves, old books, old air. She walked into the stacks. The shelving units were industrial metal, 8 feet tall, bolted to the floor. They held the library's decommissioned collection. Books that had been removed from circulation but not yet discarded or donated. Books that were, in Joan's terminology, between states, not active, not gone, held. The shelves were full. Joan walked the aisles slowly, running her hand along the spines at the far end of the stacks. The end closest to the foundation wall, she stopped. There was a shelf she didn't recognize. Not the unit. The unit was the same industrial metal as the rest. But the books on the lowest shelf of the last unit were wrong. They weren't library books. They had no spine labels, no Dewey classification stickers, no property stamps. They were unmarked, plain covers. Some cloth-bound, some leather, some in paper so old it was closer to fabric than wood pulp. Joan knelt down and pulled one out. It was handwritten. Every page, front and back, covered in small, dense handwriting. Not typed, not printed. Handwritten in ink that had faded to brown. The language was English, but the text was continuous. No paragraph breaks, no chapter headings, no page numbers, just language flowing from the first page to the last without interruption. Joan couldn't read it in the traditional sense. The handwriting was too small, too dense, and the ink too faded. But she could see the shape of it, the patterns of language, the rhythm of sentences, the places where the handwriting got slightly larger or slightly smaller, as if the writer was emphasizing or whispering. She pulled out another book, same thing. Handwritten continuous, no markings, no identification. She counted the books on the lowest shelf, 14 volumes, all handwritten, all unmarked. Joan took one upstairs. She sat at her desk with a magnifying glass and tried to read it. She could make out fragments, sentences, partial paragraphs. The text appeared to be a narrative, someone describing events, places, people. But the events didn't follow a linear sequence. The text would describe a house in one sentence and a hospital in the next. A child's birthday, then a car accident. A wedding, then a flood. It read like a life, not a story, not a fiction, but the raw, unedited accumulation of a person's experience. Set down without organization or filter, she turned to the last page. The handwriting continued to the very bottom of the page. No conclusion, no signature, no ending. The last sentence was incomplete. It stopped mid-word, as if the writer had stopped writing, or had been stopped. Joan went back to the basement and checked the other 13 volumes. Each was different handwriting. Each was continuous, unorganized, and incomplete. 14 volumes, 14 different writers. 14 lives transcribed by hand, shelved in a basement that nobody visited, in a section of overflow stacks that hadn't been inventoried in over a decade. Joan asked the obvious questions. She asked Carla, who had worked at the library for 15 years. She asked Dorothy, who had been volunteering for 8. She asked the previous head librarian, a man named Bernard, who had retired in 2018 and now lived in Bend. None of them had seen the books before. None of them knew where they'd come from. Bernard said the overflow stacks had been a mess since before my time, and that things ended up down there without being logged. Donations that missed the intake process. Estate contributions that nobody sorted. Books that materialized the way books sometimes do in institutions with open donation bins and inattentive staff. But these weren't donations. They weren't published. They weren't printed. They were handwritten, each one by a different person. Each one containing what appeared to be a complete or nearly complete human life. Joan had the books examined by a colleague at the university library, a preservationist named Dr. Lena Sorlis. Dr. Sorlis dated the paper and ink across a range of periods. The oldest book appeared to be from the early 1920s. The newest, the one with the freshest ink, the whitest paper, the most legible handwriting appeared to be from the mid-2010s. Nearly 100 years of handwritten lives, shelved together in a basement. Dr. Sorlis asked Joan where they'd come from. Joan said, "I don't know. They were just there." Dr. Sorlis asked if she could study them. Joan said she needed to think about it. She thought about it for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, she went to the basement 4 times. Each time she walked to the end of the stacks and counted the books on the lowest shelf. The first time, 14. The second time, 14. The third time, 15. Joan counted again. 15. She pulled the new book out. It was at the far right of the shelf, pressed against the wall, handwritten, continuous, incomplete, same as the others. She opened it to a random page and read, with the magnifying glass, a fragment near the top. And Joan said she needed to think about it, which was how Joan said no to things she wasn't ready to say no to. And 2 weeks felt like enough time, but it wasn't because the thinking wasn't the problem. The problem was, Joan closed the book. She put it back on the shelf. She left the basement. She did not go back for 3 months. When she finally did, in May on a Wednesday, in the middle of a shift, with Carla standing at the top of the stairs, she walked to the end of the stacks and counted. 17 books. She did not pull any of them out. She did not read them. She stood at the end of the aisle and listened. The murmur was there, faint, steady, the sound of many voices speaking at once, just below the threshold of comprehension. The sound of a room full of people talking quietly about things they remembered. Joan stood there for approximately 2 minutes. Then she said out loud to the room, to the shelves, to whatever was writing, "I'm not going to read them. I'm not going to remove them. But I need you to stay down here." The murmur continued for a moment. Then it faded, not stopped, faded like a crowd dispersing, like the end of a meeting, like people gathering their things and leaving one by one until the room was empty. Joan went upstairs. She locked the basement door. She told Carla that the overflow stacks were on hold for a comprehensive inventory that she would conduct eventually, and that in the meantime, nobody needed to go down there. Carla, who knew Joan well enough to read the space between her words, said okay. She didn't ask why. Joan was grateful for that. The library continued to operate normally. Patrons came and went. Books were checked out and returned. The building did what buildings do. It held things. But Joan, for the remaining 4 years before her retirement, kept one new habit. Every Monday morning, before the library opened, she went to the basement alone. She walked to the end of the stacks. She counted the books. The number went up. Slowly, irregularly, but consistently. By the time she retired, there were 23. She never read another one. She never told Dr. Sourless. She never filed an inventory report. On her last day, she went to the basement one final time. She stood at the end of the aisle. The murmur was there. It was always there now, she realized. Not just when the building was empty or the alarm was ringing. Always. A low, constant collective sound, like a library should sound. Like the sound of reading, if reading had a sound. Like the sound of lives being held in a room that was built to hold them. Joan said, "I'm leaving. Carla's good. She'll leave you alone." The murmur shifted. Not louder, not quieter. It changed quality. The way a room full of people changes when someone they know walks in. A warmth, an acknowledgement. Joan locked the basement door for the last time and gave her keys to Carla. She told Carla one thing, one instruction, one request that she framed as building maintenance, but that both of them understood was something else. Don't inventory the basement stacks. Don't let anyone inventory them. And if you hear something down there, something that sounds like people talking, don't worry about it. They're just reading, Carla said. Okay, Joan. Joan retired. She moved to the coast. She reads a lot. More than she did when she was surrounded by books all day, which she finds ironic. She doesn't know what the books are. She doesn't know who writes them, or how they appear, or why the murmur sounds like a crowd, and why the crowd sounds different depending on who's listening. She doesn't know why Helen heard narration, and George heard singing, and Alexis heard a woman speaking. All at the same time. All from the same building. But she has a theory. She shared it once with Carla over coffee a year after retiring. She said, "I think the building is a library. Not just functionally, structurally, essentially, at the level of what it is. We built it to hold language. We filled it with stories and information and lives compressed into pages. And at some point, maybe from the beginning, maybe gradually, the building started doing what we trained it to do. It started collecting." Carla asked, "Collecting what?" Joan said, "Everyone who comes through the door. Every patron, every life that passes through the building and sits in a chair and reads and breathes and exists in that space for an hour or a day or 22 years. The building collects them, not their bodies. Their text, the version of them that's made of language, the story they'd be if someone wrote them down." She paused. "I think the books in the basement are the library's own collection. Not one we built, one it built. And the murmur, the sound everyone hears differently, is the collection being maintained. Shelved, organized, read aloud by something that doesn't know how to read, silently, because it learned from us. And we've been reading aloud in that building since 1952. Carla was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Joan, one of those books was about you." Joan nodded. "I know." "Did you read it?" "I read one paragraph. It described me deciding not to read it. Then I stopped." "What would have happened if you kept reading?" Joan looked at her coffee. She looked out the window at the ocean. She looked back at Carla. "I think the book would have kept going. I think it would have described me reading it. And then it would have described what I did after. And it would have been accurate. Not because it predicted the future, but because it was being written in real time, by something that knows well enough to get the sentences right." She took a sip of coffee. "And I think if I'd read to the end, if I'd gotten to the last page, the sentence would have been incomplete. Just like all the others. Stopped mid-word." Carla said. "Why?" Joan said. "Because the last sentence doesn't get finished until you do. 3 stories. 3 sounds that couldn't be explained. A tone in a sealed room that gave back 30 years of absorbed sound to the one person who knew how to listen. A child's voice on a dead channel that carried a name from one crisis to another, through a system saturated with human terror. A murmur in a basement that was the sound of a building doing what it was built to do. Collecting, shelving, maintaining the lives that passed through it. None of these sounds were random. None of them were meaningless. And none of them were fully understood by the people who heard them. That's what makes unexplained sounds different from other kinds of mysteries. A strange sight can be rationalized, lighting, perspective, fatigue. A strange feeling can be dismissed, anxiety, imagination, too much coffee. But a sound, A sound enters you. It bypasses the cognitive filters that protect you from things you don't want to believe. You can close your eyes, you can't close your ears. And once you've heard something that doesn't fit, once your brain reaches for the file and comes back empty, you are changed. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but permanently. Because now you know that your catalog of safe sounds is incomplete. That there are frequencies your life hasn't filed. That the silence you sleep in every night is not silence at all, but a collection of sounds you've agreed to ignore. And collections grow. Ask Joan, she counted. So tonight, when you turn off the lights, when the house goes quiet, when the world reduces to the hum of your refrigerator and the settle of your floors and the rhythm of your own breathing, listen. Not for something new. For something that's been there all along, waiting for you to run out of noise. You'll know it when you hear it. It won't have a file.